How you doing, everyone? And welcome to Direct Dreadnought Gundam and More on PS4. And this is the 2021 Dreadnought Officer Briefing Review. I like to put these out probably once a year, and I have a 4-part series that goes very in-depth to all of the officer briefings, their applications, and where to find them in the game. But I do like to come up with shorter and more current versions of this officer briefing review, and that's what we're doing today. But I do want to make truncated, easier to watch and digest episodes for things like Dreadnought's lore or its officer briefings or tactics, just so newer players to the game can get a quick introduction, and if they want to go more in depth, they can go back and watch the originals, or current subscribers and viewers or veterans of the game can get an overview of the officer briefings and a quick refresher, and maybe think of different ways to apply some of the officer briefings and also modules and builds to maybe come up with something new and quite possibly change the meta for Dreadnought. So, without a long-winded introduction, what I do like to say about officer briefings is that they don't break the game. Some of them are quite powerful and will dramatically change certain individual builds. But for the most part, you want to use good gameplay tactics, good power management, and good teamwork to carry yourself to victory in a Dreadnought match. However, many times these officer briefings will give that little something extra, that little edge over another player of equal skill or ship value that does not have these officer briefings. So if you've already gotten your favorite ships and you're looking for ways to take on tougher opponents or to get an edge over other players, you may want to start investing time into grabbing some of these officer briefings, especially the ones that are easy to get or the ones that appeal to you or are key to your favorite ship. Also, on top of all that, you get a little extra insight and experience when going into other trees or playing ships you may not be familiar with. You don't have to go all the way to tier 5 with these. Many of them you can go to tier 4. Some of them you can go to tier 3, and you get a little bit of experience for some of the ships that you may not know much about or tend to give you a problem on the battlefield, and that will give you tactical insight as well as acquiring these officer briefings. I know several players who are very good and veterans of the game that still don't have all the officer briefings, and sometimes I feel that can limit their gameplay and make the game a little more boring for them. But let's go ahead and jump right in, and the first thing I want to tell you about is, of course, the Tier 3 officer briefings. There are altogether 16 officer briefings in the game, one for every ship, and there's 5 ships in every megacorporation's tree. That's 5 ship classes, and each class will have one officer briefing, but Akula Vector has 2 in their Dreadnought line on their tree, and that's the 16th officer briefing. Some companies offer most of their officer briefings at tier 4. Jupiter Arms offers a couple of them at tier 3, but all megacorporations offer an officer briefing at tier 3, and they're much easier to get to. Many times the officer briefing offered with a ship is beneficial to that specific class. Many times you get an officer briefing from a particular ship or class that is more useful on other ships. So that's why I like to do these officer briefing reviews, to let you know where to find and how to get the officer briefing that could make your Dreadnought experience that much better. So let's take a look here at tier 3. So the first officer briefing I want to talk to you about at tier 3 is Feedback Loop. This is, in fact, out of all the officer briefings in the game, my favorite. I think that it doesn't have any disadvantages, except, of course, you're giving up your Communications 101 to utilize Feedback Loop. It's very easy to get to, and it fits into so many builds. It's a great standalone officer briefing, but it also pairs well with certain modules, certain builds, and certain other officer briefings. It's not the sharpest or coolest officer briefing, but it's very dependable, and although it won't alone win you the match, it can contribute to an all-around build that's very, very tough to crack. What does feedback loop do? Well, every time one of your modules comes off cooldown, the amount of seconds total that that module had to wait to come off of cooldown is divided by 3, and that number is instantly added to your energy pool. It is rounded down, but for instance, if you use evasive maneuvers, it's 4-second cooldown, and then you divide it by 3, rounded down, you get 1 energy every time you use evasive maneuvers. If you have a nuclear missile, and the nuclear missile has about a minute cooldown, when you get your nuclear missile back, you're going to get 20 power instantly. Now, sometimes this can be wasted if you don't have good power management, but if you're looking down at your modules and seeing what the countdowns are, especially for dreadnoughts, especially for tactical cruisers, destroyers, that are very module intensive, not so much artillery cruisers, but it's still useful on artillery cruisers if you get in the habit of judiciously using power to weapons. But every time your modules come back, you're getting power, and if you see that one of your modules is at 5 seconds or less and you have a full energy tank, you just go ahead and put energy into weapons and slam someone, or put energy into shields and intentionally take some damage, and then that will be instantly replenished and keep you in the fight much longer. And many times when you're at 0 power, then this will save you. A lot of times I've been saved with a missile or some sort of module or pulse coming off of cooldown just in the nick of time to give me maybe 5-10 power, and then I throw my shields up and absorb an incoming missile volley, etc., etc. It's very good and very easy to get to. The Jupiter Arms Tree always starts with the Tier 1 Augusta, and it goes to the Trafalgar, but before you can get the Trafalgar, you have to invest into the Dover, the Tier 2 Jupiter Arms Corvette. And from there is where you find feedback loop. And even if you don't have a lot of experience lying around, you can just play the Palos just long enough so that you can get feedback loop. The Palos isn't a terrible ship. It's only a couple days, a few hours worth of gameplay to get feedback loop, and feedback loop is also a very, very good soft counter to disruptor, because if someone Tartarus missiles you or disruptor missiles you, it's really fun to be Tartarus, and then as soon as Tartarus wears off, many of your modules will come back, and all of a sudden you get a big fat 20-30 power back into the tank that was drained by the Tartarus. So it's a pretty good counter to Tartarus, soft counter to a lot of disruptor technology. And also you can play games with this, such as with Reinforced, where Reinforced is increasing the overall cooldown of many of your modules, and then all of a sudden you can kind of take advantage of that disadvantage and get more power every time the module goes off cooldown, and still get the hull bonus. And it doesn't work well with anything that plays off of being at 0 power. So it's not going to work with rapid fire shenanigans on artillery cruisers as much, and in fact isn't very strong on artillery cruisers, but it pairs very well if you're using Navigation Expert plus feedback loop on corvettes or Oberon artillery cruisers that you're trying to get into good positioning without wasting a lot of power. There's a lot you can do with feedback loop. It's not game breaking, but it is my favorite, and it's really easy to get to. While we're in the Jupiter Arms Tree and at Tier 3, we notice that the Tier 3 Machias also has an officer briefing. That means 2 of the 4 officer briefings available at Tier 3 is in the Jupiter Arms Tree, which is kind of to make up for the fact that they only have 1 ship in Tier 1 and basically only 2 ships at Tier 2. But you get this bonus, and Get My Good Side's an interesting one. It's very, very simple. Every 400 points of damage you take, you get a power. And that's pretty cool. It's passive like feedback loop. You don't have to do anything specific or score a kill. As you see, it's very easy to get to. You don't even have to go to the Palos. You just go from the Tier 1 Jupiter Arms destroyer right into the Dover, and from the Dover into the Machias, and then you have yourself Get My Good Side. Now, the thing about Get My Good Side, the bonuses of it is that it works through shields. So if your shields are absorbing anywhere from 50 to 80% of the damage coming through, 96 I believe, or 90 for Corvettes, the damage that bleeds through your shields counts for Get My Good Side. So you can have your shields up as a Dreadnought, take an enormous amount of damage, and have your shields and other modules decrease that damage, and what little damage does bleed through, every time it's 400 points or any derivative of that, 800 points, 1200 points, you're going to get power which can go right back in your shields and keep you in the fight much longer. It's extremely good for Dreadnoughts. It's not critical. There are many builds, many Dreadnought builds that don't use Get My Good Side, and in several other ships, it's really, for a lot of fast destroyers, for a lot of corvettes, you really don't want to be broadsiding in these ships. You want to be either darting in, darting out, running away, attacking. So it's not as useful as feedback loop, but it will benefit you. And in fact, I think with certain combinations, especially slow and steady, this is better than your basic engineering 101. You're going to lose a little bit of durability, that's 6.5% extra durability, but you're getting a whole lot more power back, and you can use that power to change the state of your situation in the game, to either put more power to shields, get away with power to engines, or a little more power to blast somebody while you're trading blows by putting power to weapons. So it is pretty interesting, and you can do a couple of very subtle tricks with it, but for the most part you want this on a heavy destroyer, or maybe possibly an Oberon Artillery cruiser if you remember to keep your side facing the enemies and keep your shields up when you're getting hit. But especially on Dreadnoughts, this is very useful if you're a broadsiding Dreadnought, because it keeps you in the fight, and you can make up for that lost 6.5% durability by taking slow and steady, which we'll get to next. That adds more durability at the sacrifice of just a little speed if you're already a slow ship. So this is another easy one to get to. It's not as useful as other Tier 3 officer briefings, but it's still useful in several builds, and it's good to have in your collection, because if you find yourself taking a lot of damage from the side and you keep running out of power, this could be a good way to supplement your game style. Now we're moving on to the third Tier 3 officer briefing, Slow and Steady, found on the Chernobog, a fine ship, and this is probably the least hard officer briefing you have to go digging for. You start with the Smurgle, go to the nav, go to the Chernobog, and it's there. And it's a very awesome passive officer briefing. You don't have to do anything specific. You're just sacrificing your movement speed, also the additional movement speed you would have got from Navigation 101, to get a damage resistance of plus 10%. This may sound a lot, because you're essentially trading a potential 10% plus an additional 10% to get 10% damage resistance. But you're going to have to sacrifice the 10% movement speed anyway from Navigation 101, and if you use the right ship, particularly slower ships, you're really not losing that much. This is really good on Dreadnoughts, particularly Dreadnoughts that jump around and really don't move. Even the Oberon Dreadnoughts that are supposedly known for their speed really don't lose much speed, and they gain so much with the additional damage resistance. Of course, this damage resistance will combo well with Engineering 101, because it will bring your total damage resistance up to 16.5%, which means if you're not using armor amplifier, or if you're using a lower level armor amplifier, or you're using armor booster pulse, that is a considerable increase, turning a 50 or 60 into a up to 75% damage resistance, and that's pretty darn good for just one module. And it also combos well with things like Get My Good Side, because as you take damage from Get My Good Side and you're gaining that power, you lose that passive 6.5% damage resistance from Engineering 101, and you can make up for it with Slow and Steady. And let's face it, if you are a very slow Dreadnought, particularly a Jupiter Arms Dreadnought, or even the Dreadnought from the Akula Vector series, or the Blood, the Muramets, artillery cruisers are very slow. The Koshei, I like to put this on the Koshei, you're only losing on average 2 to 4 speed, and the difference in game going from maybe say 30 to 26 or from 24 to 20 isn't very noticeable. And you're gaining so much more beefiness, especially on ships that already have huge hull point pools, and this includes the final Tier 3 Officer Briefing, which we will get to in just a little bit. Reinforced, this pairs well with that as well. It just makes you extra tough. Save the Akula Vector Corvette series. I use Slow and Steady on all my Akula Vector ships. It's very useful. It really doesn't penalize you that much, and it gives you so much more beefiness. And I even have builds for teleporting Corvettes that use target warp, that use Slow and Steady, and you can also use this on the Jupiter Arms Dreadnought series. You can also use this on the Oberon Dreadnought series. Very useful. I would say this is probably the second most useful officer briefing in the game. Of course, most Corvettes want to stay away from Slow and Steady. Also, many destroyers, particularly Oberon destroyers, really want to stay away, because that 10% you're losing, and even the 10% you're losing from Navigation 101, it's really better just to use Navigation 101 until you get another officer briefing that fits better, like Navigation Expert or Engine Rigger. So certain models of ship really want to stay away from this, but most ships can benefit from this. And if you don't have a very large officer briefing pool, you can use this to supplement many of your ship builds and make them much tougher to kill, particularly if you combo with other modules or other officer briefings to make a very sturdy, tanky ship build. Alright, now we move to the last easy to grab Tier 3 officer briefing. And I think it's a good one, but it's just not as useful as some of the other ones. But it's a great one to have if you never want to touch Oberon ships or dive into the Oberon tree. You won't miss this officer briefing. But if you're already in the tree, you might as well pick it up, because it's very useful on not just some Oberon ships, but particularly Akula Vector ships, and of course, quite possibly on some Jupiter Arms builds. So, it's reinforced, and you find it on the series. So, like the Akula Vector Dreadnoughts, you don't really have to travel far into the tree. If you're already playing the Cerberus at Tier 1 and you get the Orcus at Tier 2, you might as well just grab the series, put some points into it, and get reinforced. And who knows, you might find a niche for it in some odd build, particularly if you want to dive into Akula Vector. I have a lot of Akula Vector ships, including the Akula Vector Corvette. My favorite Akula Vector Corvette build uses reinforced, and I also use reinforced on some of my Monarch builds, and I use reinforced on several other ships. I also use it on the Blood, and people say that is a little strange, but I'm telling you, my Blood is a tough nut to crack. When you combine this with Slow and Steady, you get the extra hull points, and particularly if you grab Energy Generator, you're just this big sitting tank that just dishes out so much punishment. The problem is, this is one of those officer briefings where you have to give a little to get something. So of course you're giving up your native 6.5% damage resistance buff from Engineering 101, and you're also increasing the module cooldown of all your modules by 20%. So you have two strategies to use here. You either want to use modules that have a very low cooldown, let's say Ballistic Broadside. The 20% seems to be rounded down, so Ballistic Broadside only increases by 1 second, and 1 second is nothing in game, particularly if you're using certain officer briefings to reduce the cooldown of your modules. You can also pair this with Communications 101. I have a Muramets build where it's reinforced, Slow and Steady with Communications 101, and it kind of takes away 10% of the additional cooldown, so it's really only an increase of 10%, and I think that's really good. And you get an increased max HP of 18% on the Monarch. This brings you up to a whopping 106,500 hull points, which means even if people disrupt and drain you all day, it takes so long to chew through you. It is so ridiculous. I use this on the Akula Vector Destroyer, the Gora, to give it more hull points than in out-of-the-box Lorica or Invictus. So it's quite impressive the amount of hull points you can get out of this, but it comes at a cost. It's easy to get, but it comes at a cost, and it doesn't really fit well on most tactical cruisers, because a lot of tactical cruisers don't want to wait the additional few seconds to pump out those pods or get those critical modules back online. You can use it, but many tactical cruisers have a particularly low hull to begin with, so you don't want to use this on, I would say, a Vindicta, a Brutus, any of the Corvettes, or most of the tactical cruisers, because getting 18% more hull on one of these ships is maybe absorbing a tiny bit more fire to get a very heavy penalty in all of your modules. However, if your ship is very beefy to begin with and you already have other officer briefings or modules to make it even beefier, and you're using things like Retaliator to already decrease your cooldown, or even Communications 101, all of a sudden you're adding a whole, sometimes as much as 10, 12, 15,000 hull points to your hull pool. And that is very impressive when you factor in shields and modules and anything that increases the sturdiness or tankiness of your ship. Sometimes you can only be taking 4% damage, and 4% spread across 10,000 extra hull points. It's quite impressive. It takes other players a long time to chew through that. So I wouldn't call this a godsend. I wouldn't say that this is an overpowered officer briefing by any means, but as a tier 3 officer briefing, it's pretty easy to get to and certainly has its place amongst certain builds. So now we're into the tier 4 officer briefings, which all of them take a little bit to get to. Some are even worse than others. Many of these officer briefings are particularly powerful, and the one I have to shine a spotlight on, which is arguably overpowered, would be the Jupiter Arms Jutland Retaliator officer briefing. So we're going to jump back to the Jupiter Arms tree and take a look at some of these, and this is probably the most powerful officer briefing in the game overall, and that's a huge statement, and it's a very arguable statement. But if you are a Dreadnought in Legendary, you need this officer briefing. Even if you're in tier 3 in veteran mode, having this officer briefing dramatically changes the gameplay for your Dreadnoughts. All the Dreadnoughts. In fact, I would say anyone in Dread Chat or anyone on the channel that's a veteran would know that Retaliator is a staple for Dreadnought builds. But what does it do? First of all, we find it on the Jutland, and to get the Jutland, you have to go all the way through the Jupiter Arms Destroyer tree to the Otranto and get to the Jutland. So if you're not already in the Jupiter Arms tree, this one's particularly hard to get to, which means you have to invest a lot of time and effort to get there. However, it isn't very hard to navigate the tree to get to it, and if you're already investing in the Jupiter Arms tree, you probably already have up to the Otranto so that you could get the Ballista, or you could get the Palos through the Trafalgar, or if you like the Jupiter Arms Corvettes, you're already investing in the Jupiter Arms Destroyer branch. So if you want to get the Vigo or the Athos, you're going to pick the Jutland up on the way anyway. And if you're going to do that, you might as well grab Retaliator. And here's the thing, is Retaliator works well on several other ships, not just Dreadnoughts. But it's a staple for Dreadnoughts, and what it does is, as your shields take damage, it reduces the module cooldowns. And that doesn't seem very impressive. You're like, well, doesn't Communication 101 already do that? No, my friend, it does not. Not like this. If you get a nuke on your shield, it basically sends all of your modules off cooldown instantly. That's pretty awesome. Also, when you're broadsiding and duking it out with other Dreadnoughts, or just trying to get to the fight and taking damage on your shield, it is working so well. Basically, anytime you take damage to your shields, no matter what the amount is, you're dropping your cooldown by a second. If you take a missile volley, it's going to be 10 seconds. If you take artillery cruiser hits, it's going to be like 3 to 5 seconds per hit. If you take a nuke, it's going to drop it 30-40 seconds. The amount of damage that you take on the shields affects the amount of cooldown drop. If you take a broadside to your shields, you're definitely dropping probably 5 to 7 seconds off all of your modules. So you will see Dreadnoughts be able to use armor amplifier or jump in and jump out very, very quickly, probably half as long as they would have to wait without Retaliator. And on top of that, you can use this on tactical cruisers to pump out pods faster by flying to the top of the map and delivering an artillery pod, intentionally taking damage to your shields, then dropping a few more pods, and then when you start getting a little weak in your position and attracting too much fire, you can either warp out or quickly run away, putting additional energy into your navigation, into your speed and engines. And it's really good way to get things out faster. There's several builds on destroyers where you charge in, intentionally take damage to your shields while you alpha strike, and then be able to alpha strike much quicker again. And then you can even use things such as cooldown reduction modules as well as other officer briefings to basically fire 3 volleys of an alpha strike. You can do a lot with Retaliator. It even has its place on certain Corvette builds, particularly target warp Corvette builds where you throw up your armor amplifier and you have slow and steady and reinforced, and then you throw your shields up and you're basically using Retaliator to counter the effects of reinforced while you're using modules and other officer briefings to absorb fire and just simply wail on a ship, and then rinse, repeat, warp out to the next target. It's quite an impressive officer briefing, and it stinks if you're in the Akula Vector or Oberon line and you really like those Dreadnoughts, but most of the veteran players that have Oberon Tier 4 or 5 Dreadnoughts, particularly Akula Vector Tier 4 and 5 Dreadnoughts, will often race through the destroyers and get to the Jutland just to get this officer briefing, even if they don't like the Monarch or the Jutland. So I would highly recommend this. The combos are almost endless with this particular officer briefing, except anything that drains your shields, except anything especially artillery cruisers that are using any module that drains the shields, or you're using your shields for speed and you hardly put up your shields. Many Corvettes rarely use their shields. They're always speeding around with thrust amplifier or teleporting around. Any ships like that want to stay away from Retaliator. If you're using Navigation Expert, your shields will go away faster, so you don't want to use Retaliator necessarily. But for many, many ships, if you have nothing better to put in there, Retaliator is the way to go, especially if you find yourself putting your shields up often in a match. While we're still in the Jupiter Arms tree, if you decide that you only like Jupiter Arms destroyers, which you'd be surprised how many players do until they branch out into other aspects of the game, if you get yourself to the Vigo, you get yourself a chance to pick up Nerves of Steel. I used to hate this module with a passion, but they did a slight buff to it many, many, many months ago. And if you use this particular officer briefing correctly, you will have a pretty awesome time. It's pretty much a standalone officer briefing. It can half combo with other modules and officer briefings, but really all it does is, if you have nothing better to put in this slot, if you're speeding around and you're a fairly fast ship and you find yourself putting power to engines very often and you don't have Navigation Expert, this is a really good one to have. I use it on my Jupiter Arms destroyers, but I also use it on my Oberon and Jupiter Arms tactical cruisers. It has a place on Corvettes if you don't have something better to put in your navigation slot. And even a couple Oberon Dreadnought builds can use Nerves of Steel pretty effectively. And basically, while you have, it's an active type officer briefing, we haven't really looked at many of those yet. which means you have to do something to trigger the officer briefing. It's not passive like many of the ones we've looked at so far. So if you have power to engines and then you take damage while you have power to engines, you will instantly get a damage reduction buff of 5%, kind of like Engineering 101, but not as good. But it'll only apply to the next shot, and it's only up for a certain amount of time depending on the amount of damage you took. If you get hit with an artillery cruiser while you have power to engines, you'll get that buff for a good long time. If you're just getting peppered by fire, it stays up for maybe a second or two. But if it's a stream of fire, that second or two will keep stacking and you'll keep getting that 5% damage buff. It won't increase, but you'll get it longer. Additionally, you'll get a boost movement speed by 200% buff, and that actually lasts at least a second or two. If you're good at dodging and you take hits maybe once every second or two, you can almost be constantly moving at 3 to 4 times your normal speed while you have the powered engines. The problem with this is you don't have your shields up while you're taking fire, so you really have to be good at dodging shots, or you're going to find yourself getting killed very easily and just should have having put your shields up. It's very good for kiting enemy opponents, and it's also very good for escaping. If you think you're going to die anyway, then screw it. You might as well try to get away. You put power to engines and you try to do evasive maneuvers that be on your controller, not the actual module evasive maneuvers, even though that pairs well with this officer briefing, and you'll find yourself being able to survive some crazy stuff. But there are better officer briefings out there. However, this is fairly easy to get to on certain ships will work for you if you don't have something better. While we're in the Jupiter Arms tree, let's jump up a class and look at the Onager, which is the Tier 4 Jupiter Arms artillery cruiser. You can get the ballista between the Trafalgar and the Otranto, and many people, many players who play artillery cruisers simply love Jupiter Arms artillery cruisers. Arguably the best in the game. Not the tankiest, not the fastest. I would say Oberon is overall the best in the game, but man, some of my best replays have been in Jupiter Arms artillery cruisers, so it's not such of a pain to get there. In fact, if you have a good teammate with you, or a good squad mate, and you're with a good team, or you have a good map that isn't close quarters and there's not a lot of places to hide, you can really rack up the kills on this ship. So it's not such a pain to get to. You just go down the destroyer line a little, hop up to the artillery line, and before you know it, you're at the Onager and you're at Survival Instinct. Survival Instinct used to be a pretty poor officer briefing and make people sad, just like Nerves of Steel used to, but it got a little bit of a boost, and now the wording is your health, as it is missing by 10% incrementally, which means as you take every stack of 10% damage, dropping you from 90% of your original total to 80 to 70 to 60 per 10% lost, you're getting a reload time of -7% per stack to a max of 63%, which means the more damage you take, the faster your reload time is, which is absolutely fantastic. I stopped using flak and repeater guns on my Monarch and Jutland builds simply because the main guns reload too quickly. There's really no reason, ever since the main guns got a buff, it's just amazing. And any ship that has a long reload time, this really helps. Particularly, this is one of the few officer briefings in the game that really benefits the ship that it's on, because you may go another route as far as increasing your damage with other officer briefings, but if you don't have those officer briefings and you have Survival Instinct and you start taking damage, or you're getting pressured by a corvette or a destroyer, or you take a nuke hit and are still alive, you can just flash out that fire very, very quickly and really put some hurt on some enemy targets, and it works very well on several other ships. Of course, Survival Instinct is absolutely useless on the Jupiter Arms beam weapons. Same with any other tactical cruiser, except if you're using some of the TAC cruiser secondary weapons like the chain guns or rockets. It can even help on many other ships, not really most Corvette builds, maybe Oberon, but their reload time is pretty low. It does help on Akula Vector Corvettes if you don't have some of the other modules or officer briefings that will aid the Akula Vector Corvettes. This is a good stopgap measure, and it's not very good on the Jupiter Arms destroyers. It already has a low cooldown, but any ship that has a high cooldown, this really helps, particularly if you're getting stuck in like a Dreadnought. I put this on just about all my Dreadnoughts. It's really good, and it also works well on artillery cruisers and some destroyers. So I would say Survival Instinct is worth getting if you're already in the neighborhood of Jupiter Arms artillery cruisers. So let's jump into the Akula Vector tree, and again we find ourselves in the Akula Vector Dreadnought line, because there are in fact 2 officer briefings in the Akula Vector Dread line. The first, of course, slow and steady with the Chernobog, but if you continue on to the Voronezh on your quest to get the Zeme, which allegedly is the king of the battlefield, and there's a lot of evidence to support that, there is Last Resort in Tier 4 on the Voronezh. So, Last Resort is pretty interesting. It got changed out, and it's not the original officer briefing that came with the Akula Vector line, and we're not going to go too much into the history of that because we want to keep this pretty short and sweet. But Last Resort, the effect is it gives you 10% rate of fire, negative 15% reload speed, which all sounds good, plus it's passive. You don't have to do anything particular to activate it, but the activation trigger is your energy needs to be 0. First of all, if you've watched my How to Be Good at Dreadnought or many of my tactics videos, you know that being at 0 power is a bad thing. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but you really don't want to be in that situation. You always want some reserve power in the tank, and many builds use things like feedback loop, energy generator, or get my good side to keep the energy coming so you can keep the shields up, so you can keep the speed up, or you can keep the firepower up. So Last Resort has its place with anything that knocks the power out of your ship intentionally. Whether that means you're a crazy person and you like to speed around, then put power to weapons and flak people, or particularly if you're an artillery cruiser that is using any module that drains your power in order to use more firepower to destroy the enemy. So Last Resort is an interesting one. If you've already gone through the Akula Vector Dread line, you might as well pick it up because you will find some use for it on certain builds. But this is one of those officer briefings that has a lot of counterintuitive use with other, it comes into conflict with other officer briefings and modules. So you have to be very specific when you use it, or it's never going to kick in. If you're putting this on your ship and you're putting more power modules on your ship and you have other ways of getting power and you're good with power usage, it's never going to come up, and you might as well just get that 6.5% from Engineering 101. But it does have some interesting uses, and if someone can make a build using Last Resort effectively, you see it on artillery cruisers particularly, it can combine well with other stacking modules and officer briefings to put out a tremendous amount of fire, but only under the most ideal conditions. Now we're jumping up to the Akula Vector Destroyer line, which is really easy to get to if you like Akula Vector Dreadnoughts. Then on your way to get the Chernobog, you can get the Dola, and then you find out, well, there isn't really much difference between the Akula Vector Dreadnoughts and the Akula Vector Destroyers. And many players would also jokingly say there's very little difference between an Oberon Dreadnought and an Akula Vector Destroyer. The Akula Vector Destroyers have lackluster guns that are really powerful, hard to aim, but have a good sized clip. In addition to that, they are very chunky and sturdy. They're pretty slow, but sometimes speed doesn't matter if you're using terrain or you're parked next to a tactical cruiser. Using those things to your advantage and just dishing out the punishment, and you can stick it right in there with an Akula Vector Dreadnought side by side, escort it right in and give it firepower while it gives you protection. It's a great ship. So this particular officer briefing is fairly easy to get to. If you're an Oberon or a Jupiter Arms player, once you get your tree done or enough of the tree where you're satisfied with it, it's really easy to invest in the Akula Vector, Dread, and Destroyer line. Doesn't take much time, and both of these ships are always in the middle of the fighting, always taking damage, always giving you points, and always getting you those kills, even if you do die a lot. It doesn't matter. You're going to get experience out of these ships. And these ships are not pushovers, so you're not going to feel bad after you eventually go down. So what is Module Ampere? It's found on the Blood, which is a fine ship, and what it does is when you put power to weapons, you're adding 30% damage to your main guns. But what this does, in addition to that, in addition to the normal effects of putting power to weapons, this adds 30% damage to your modules or your healing modules. That is huge. This is really great on tactical cruisers because if you have artillery pods out there or you're using nukes, mines, or something else like that, you can put power to weapons to increase your heal while you're increasing the damage of these other things. It is tricky if you're not using something that's easy to deal with. If you're ramming, assault blink warping, using flash torpedoes, it's easy to time a module Ampere. Or if you're passively doing it while healing and your artillery pods are just going nuts on their own, using module Ampere is really, really easy. When you're using missiles or torpedoes that are long range, it's really, really hard to time it. You can't just use it when you launch, which is the way it was originally in the game. You have to be putting power to weapons while the missiles, torpedoes, or other projectiles are actually hitting the target. But if you put power to weapons at the moment of impact of a ram while you're firing your flak guns, you'll be pretty vulnerable afterwards, but you'll be piling on so much damage. Module Ampere is extremely key on several tactical cruiser builds, and it's very, very key on assault blink warp, and it pairs very well with module recycler. It's a great, and also if you're using a more tanky build, not a sneaky build, if you're using a power generator and retaliator to absorb damage and stay in the fight longer when someone's not shooting you, then you can put power to weapons with your energy generator and increase the damage of your offensive modules. So it's a really great, solid officer briefing. You're only losing Weapons 101, so you're losing 6%. Now, I'm a huge fan of Weapons 101 because that 6.5% adds up if you're using something that's very rapid fire. Not an artillery cruiser or not some other ships that just ram or sneak or have another gimmick. But Module Ampere on several ship builds is very useful. It has several combinations you can combo with, and it's a great module. And if you're already in the Akula Vector neighborhood as far as Dreadnoughts, it's only the next street over to pick up your very tanky Akula Vector destroyer and pick this up and use it on many, many other ships and many, many other builds. Now we're moving over to the Moramets, and to get the Moramets, you have to go all the way down the Akula Vector artillery cruiser line. Now I like all three Mega Corporation's artillery cruisers. The Akula Vector are very tanky with medium damage. The Oberon have slightly higher damage and a great deal of speed, but are kind of squishy. And the Jupiter Arms are a little squishy, but have very long range and exceptional firepower. So all of them are very different, very fun to play. But, oh man, grinding your way through the Akula Vector artillery tree can be a chore, because you can get those matches where you're just getting picked on, you're not in a good position, it's not the right map for it, you're not getting the kills, you put in that damage and someone steals the kills. It's not like Oberon, where you're gunning away and you always get the last hit, or Jupiter Arms, where you're taking huge chunks out of players. It's tough sometimes to be an Akula Vector artillery cruiser, but you're not squishy, and that's one thing going for you. So while we're in the ballpark of not squishy, we have Desperate Measures. Now, I used to hate this officer briefing and think it was very, very, very overpowered. But they nerfed it a little, and I still think it's very effective. And you still see a lot of players using Desperate Measures. And sometimes, to you newer players, you might be going, what the heck? I just stunned that guy, and he's almost dead, and he had no shields, and all of a sudden he's got all this power, and he's moving around again, and he's coming back at me. What's going on? Why isn't he dead? He's not dead because he's using Desperate Measures. And what it is basically when you take a ship down to quarter health, all the modules get minus 20 seconds, which means in many cases all their modules are coming back, and if they're not coming back instantly, they'll be coming back soon. And in addition to that, it removes the debuffs such as stasis or disruptor or any of the other debuffs that may happen to you, and refills the energy to full. So, I mean, it's pretty powerful, but it's not as useful as it was. And it's not as useful on squishier ships, because I've seen squishy ships get Desperate Measures because I see their energy bar go to full all of a sudden, and then they just die because they just couldn't react fast enough to throw their shields up, and there's so much damage incoming. But if you have a slick, dodgy ship that's hard to hit, or you have a ship that's very, very tanky, and you have nothing better to put in there, let's say you're in the Akula vector tree, you just don't have the time or the inclination to go get Retaliator yet, you can use something like Desperate Measures as a stopgap. It only happens once, and that's another drawback to Desperate Measures. Once it pops, you're not getting it again. So once you go down to a quarter health again, it's not coming back, or it'll be way, way too powerful. It really works well on Novice, Brutus, or Vindicta players or Corvettes, because when you're going in and you don't care about dying and you want to go in and kill 2-3 guys, die, rinse, repeat, or go in, kill the command ship over and over and over again, rinse, repeat, and get that juicy 300 points and be on the leaderboard for the match and get the maximum amount of points, it can be very lucrative. And Desperate Measures will kick in along with your other officer briefings, and it'll get you your modules back faster. It'll give you your shields. You can throw them up and maybe kill one more person, or maybe destroy the command ship one more time. And it's particularly useful. It's also useful if you have a tactical in the area, because a lot of times tacticals don't notice you're in trouble until it's too late. And then all of a sudden, if you get your shields and you're going, please help me, please help me, please help me, need repairs, need repairs. By the time they notice, if you get your shields back and some of your modules back, let's say you get a full tank of shields, or you're a Dreadnought, and you instantly get your armor amplifier back, you throw up the armor amplifier, throw up your shields, and then the tactical cruiser wakes up and says, oh, I better heal this poor player. It can be very useful, but don't count on it. And be very careful when you use it. Don't depend on Desperate Measures to get you that kill. It's only there to supplement your gameplay and give you one last chance to make a difference before you die. Now we're getting to one of the most hated and nerfed officer briefings that ever was. When the game first came out, for those of you who weren't around, and for those of you who remember the awful nostalgia, Adrenaline Shot used to read, gain energy when you heal or are healed, which really became a monster. And of course, this is found on the Cascade, which is a particularly hard ship to get to. You got to go through the Dreadnought line, make it over to the Destroyer line, then jump over from the Destroyer line to the Tactical line, then you get the Cascade, and the Cascade starting module build is simply awful. It's just a, I don't know, I just don't like it. And I had a hard time until I got the modules I want in the Cascade. Once you get the modules you want, the Cascade and the Octa are very powerful tactical cruisers. They can be very hard to kill. They can be mobile with the right modules, or immobile if you have a heal ball forming around you, which it will, because people don't want to die usually. And it's just very hard to get to. And now it's been nerfed so bad, basically in order for it to kick in, you have to be 30% health or less. And the Cascade is tanky, but it doesn't have all that much hull compared to many, many other ships. It's still in the low 20s. Now it's been buffed, and it's kind of in the mid-20s when you get to the Octa. That's still Assault, Blink Warp, Ram killing range. that's still a couple of missile volleys and a whole lot of concentrated fire. And remember, you are the space potato. You're the giant green basketball floating in space, and you are making it harder to kill the things that everyone wants to kill. So pretty soon everyone realizes if they kill you first, whatever they want to kill will soon come up next on their docket of things to do that match. So this is just... I would not go out of your way to get Adrenaline Shot anymore. And there's so many better things you could put in the engineering slot that will do so much for you, including Engineering 101. So I'm not going to waste any more time. If you really want to argue this point with me, there's the comments below. But I think most experienced players agree that Adrenaline Shot just isn't it anymore. It's not what it used to be, and very, very few players use it. And if you are using it, perhaps you should rethink your strategy. Now let's look at the last Akula Vector Tier 4 Officer Briefing, and that's found in the Corvette line. Now the Corvette line's not too hard to get to. It comes off of the Artillery Cruiser line, so if you're already an Artillery Cruiser captain, it's not too hard to get the Kreshnik or the Strybog, and this is where it shows up on the Strybog. So it is, of course, Destruction Cascade. Now, if there were to be an argument against my previous statement that Retaliator is probably the most useful and strongest officer briefing in the game, Destruction Cascade would definitely be one of those officer briefings that could give a good argument. Now, it is the most conditional officer briefing ever, and it has been known to bug out. It happens, it just stops working, and you don't notice it until many matches, and you're like, hey, wait a minute, where's my buff? Why aren't I getting my buff? And you have to complain to Raydog or Space Ghost and get that fixed. So it does have its outside game issues, and in game it is quite simple. You have to kill something. You have to destroy an enemy, and I don't mean getting a captain kill for contributing to kill an enemy and someone else gets the final blow. You have to get the final blow to use Destruction Cascade. But if you get the final blow, your gunpowder goes up 30%. That's energy to weapons, except you don't have to do that. Goes up 30% for 20 seconds, which is a pretty darn long time. And if you're doing things like ramming, if you're doing things like shooting lots of missiles and guns, and you put power to weapons anyway, you're getting plus 60%, and it helps you kill things even faster, which will reset the timer and give you another 20 seconds to beat on things. It's quite literally a Destruction Cascade. The thing about it is, until you get that first kill, you're losing your Weapons 101, you're losing that damage bonus, and you're not getting any damage bonus at all, while you have Module Ampere and several other officer briefings that are constantly helping you whether you get the kill or not. If people steal your kill, this won't pop. If you kill something but then you have to retreat, let's say you're an Oberon destroyer, a lot of Oberon destroyers are like, oh, I love Destruction Cascade. Well, okay, too bad every time you ram something and get a kill, I see you run away for 5 minutes to heal, or you just die. So how did it really help you? It doesn't help you. You need something else to help you. And that's where Module Ampere comes in, or something else. But this works particularly good on Jupiter Arms artillery cruisers, because the more ships you sink, the more damage you get, and then you pair this with other types of energy use or module that increase your firepower, even modules from other ships like destroyers doing weapon booster pulse, and pretty soon you're doing double damage, sometimes close to triple damage, if you put all the things at once on and just start putting holes in ships. It's quite impressive. Or if you're a judicious, really, really good player, you can go in with a Corvette, destroyer, or something else and kill something and have a means to survive to get to the next kill. It pairs very, very well with Module Recycler, which we'll get into in a little bit, because it makes you go out and kill the enemy. And if you kill the enemy with something like a ram or an assault blink warp or some other module that does a lot of damage, you're adding this bonus to help you for your next kill, while also reducing the modules that help you kill things. So it's really good, and it has a lot of combinations in it, and it has its use, but you have to be a good player to use it. If you're not a good player, or you die a lot, or you have to run away, you just need to be using another officer briefing because you're just not that good yet. And that's okay. There's a lot of other officer briefings to choose from. So while we're talking about modular recycler, let's jump over to Oberon's tech tree and see the first of their Tier 4 officer briefings. And that is, of course, modular recycler found on the Lorica. And to get to the Lorica, you start at the Cerberus, which is the first ship in the Oberon tree, so you have to research it anyway. And then you continue on with the Orcus, and you can jump right to the Gravis. And then after you get to the Gravis, which is in and of itself in veteran mode, once veteran mode became Tier 3 and Tier 2 only, and there were no Tier 4s, the Gravis is a really good ship to have. It's very tactically flexible and still a tough nut to crack. So you get to the Lorica, and when you get to the Lorica, you have a chance to pick up Modular Recycler. And Modular Recycler isn't very good on the Lorica unless you're really good at timing those broadsides, or if you're the best shooter of nukes in the world. But I mean, if you're doing that, you're probably not using the Lorica. The Lorica is really good at sneaking around and hitting things hard where they least expect it, while using armor amplifier and armor booster pulse, because let's face it, there are a lot of niche builds with the Lorica that don't use those modules, but you die pretty quickly. So the Lorica is really a fast dreadnought, and it has good guns, but I find myself killing things with my guns more often than with my modules in the Lorica. But there's so many other ships that really benefit from modular recycler, particularly in the Oberon line. You have, of course, the Oberon destroyers with ramming. You have all sorts of corvettes with assault blink warp. If you're a tactical cruiser, particularly an Oberon tactical cruiser, you're using artillery pods, and artillery pods are probably the way you're killing things, so it helps there too. And several other ships use modules as their killing blow. And if you use a module and get a killing blow, which means you ease up on the trigger and let your modules do their job and time it correctly, you can get negative 15-second module cooldown on all your modules. Now, if you're not using really hard-hitting modules, this isn't helping, and you might as well use Retaliator or Communications 101 to get a more consistent cooldown for you. But if you're using things like assault blink warps, rams, nukes, this can be very, very huge. Particularly, I would say the most useful modular recycler is on Oberon destroyers, arguably corvettes as well. But Oberon destroyers have enough hull to get in, more hull than a corvette. They can be fast, especially if you're using thrust amplifier. And you get in, you get the ram, and the beautiful thing about it is once you get the ram, that negative 15 will give you your thrust amplifier back. It'll give you your ram back, so you can even use a ram to go in and kill something, then use thrust amplifier and the ram to get away, or hit the next target, and it's really, really good. You can use either scramble or drain pulse over and over again. With assault blink warp, of course, is bringing back assault blink warp quicker. That's important. And it's just a nice little bonus if you tend to kill things with nuke or artillery pods. So modular recycler can be very useful, but let's face it, if you're a dreadnought, you want to be using Retaliator, or you want to be using something else if you tend to kill things with your guns. So while we're talking about Oberon destroyers, which are fairly hard to get to, you have to start with the Cerberus, get to the Furia, go up to the Fulgora, then go all the way down to the Vindicta, so it's not easy to get to the ship. Let's face it, if you want to get to the Vindicta, you are a fan of ramming or flash torpedoes, and you always want to kill someone at close range with a fast destroyer. That's what you like. If you're playing the Jupiter Arms destroyers and you find yourself ramming things because it just makes you giggle and you love it, then you're going to find yourself eventually in the captain's seat of Oberon destroyers. But they're not easy to get to, and their officer briefing is not easy to use. So you get there at the Vindicta, you find Engine Rigger, and the thing about Engine Rigger is that it seems so good on paper, but it's just so bad in game. You go an additional 100% when you use it, and you have to activate power to engines, which means you're tripling your speed because it stacks with power to engines plus 100% as well, but it almost doubles your energy usage. So you've got to find a way to get more energy or you're going to run out by the time you get there. And in your mind, you think it's all going to work out beautifully until you try to ram and you miss and you're out of energy, or you try to get in there and do something, you have no shields and people just pick you right off because they notice you. I've seen a couple of players use it well, but almost universally when a player uses engine rigor, they say the same thing. Man, it just drains my energy so fast and there's no way to compensate for it. And if you use energy generator to get the power back just to use it faster, you might as well keep your power so you can use it with shields or to use module Ampere with power to weapons and use thrust amplifier. And on Corvettes, instead of using engine rigor, you might as well use thrust amplifier there as well. Or you can use nerves of steel to get faster as you're taking damage, or you can use navigation expert to just go double speed but not use as much power and still have that power to use for other applications, and we'll get to that in a moment. But oh man, you have to be amongst the best players to use engine rigor well. You can use it with thrust amplifier and sneak around the battlefield and wait to the prime moment and then just get in there and go completely crazy, but man, it's tough to use. And I wouldn't get the Vindicta for engine rigor. I would get the Vindicta because you like to ram things or watch them explode in fireballs after you've sent your flash torpedoes or Goliath or whatever else you want to use in Oberon destroyers. That's why you want the Vindicta, not this officer briefing. So now we move up to the Oberon Artillery, and remember, even though the tree doesn't represent this, the Oberon Artillery was Oberon and Enyo's first vessel. This was their vessel. It was not copied from transhumans. This is their signature vessel. So you do have to get the Cerberus first, then go to the Furia, then just continue right down the line till you get to the Nox, and the Nox is a fine ship, and the Stabia is a fine ship. In Oberon Artillery, once you get the hang of it, it's not like other artillery cruisers. You want to keep on the move. You're squishy, but you can get to those hard to scratch places and really give it to players, and you can flank the enemy and use powerful modules from range, or you can get in the thick of it and use your auto beams to great effect. There's a lot of things you can do. It's a very versatile artillery cruiser, and it has a pretty cool officer briefing, and that's glass cannon. And glass cannon is it says it's active, but it's kind of passive. You don't have to work for it. It's not like Destruction Cascade where you have to kill something, or it's not like Nerves of Steel where you have to put power to engines and hope someone hits you, but hope they don't hit you too much or you'll die quicker. Glass cannon is very simple. Are you at full health? If you are, guess what? You get plus 20% to your weapons. Did you take a single hit from one of those onslaught little ships that float around and you took 1 point of damage? Guess what? You lose your bonus. So it used to be a lot worse, and I won't get into that. It did get a slight buff, and I think it's very stable. It's a great officer briefing if you don't want to think too hard about officer briefings. If you have glass cannon and you're using it on the Nox, that's great. If you have other ships, you can use it on those too, as long as you are a coward and you avoid damage altogether. It's not going to work on a Dreadnought, okay? It's not going to work on a Dreadnought. Maybe a day long ago it would have, if you were Cartoon or Six Pack and you were using back-to-back invulnerability, but that's gone from Dreadnoughts now. And it's gone from Corvette shields. There's no such thing as invulnerability, so you can't exploit invulnerability to use glass cannon. You can, however, be very far away, like in a Jupiter Arms artillery cruiser, very sneaky, like in a cloaked Corvette or a very nimble Oberon artillery cruiser, or even a Brutus if you're really good at sneaking up on your opponent. Or if you stay fully healed at all times, if you're a heal ball tactical cruiser, and there's things you can do with glass cannon. It's very useful. I use it on several builds. It's probably the biggest rival for Destruction Cascade, but you have to do a lot less work and a lot less thinking, and of course the bonus isn't as good as Destruction Cascade. And a lot of times if I see someone getting really good damage, I'll pepper them in case they're using glass cannon, and if I don't have a kill coming up, I'll just pepper everybody to stop them from their normal healing replenishment, their normal regeneration. It's a good tactic to use. Just pepper a Dreadnought once in a while. You're not going to kill it. Or pepper an artillery cruiser, makes them freak out, and if they're using glass cannon, it knocks them out of glass cannon bonus. So that's a good way to soft counter glass cannon, but it's a pretty useful officer briefing. And if you're already in the neighborhood, if you're already in the Oberon tree, I would pick it up. Plus, using Oberon Artillery cruisers is a lot of fun. It's a wild ride, and it brings new perspective to the game. So we are at the last officer briefing in the game that I'm going to review for 2021, and that's the Tier 4 officer briefing navigation expert found on the Medusa. The Medusa isn't too hard to get to. It's not straightforward. You got to hit up the Oberon tactical cruiser, get to the Fury artillery cruiser, get to the Fulgora, and then get to the Medusa. The Fulgora is not an easy corvette to use. The Medusa is a little better, and the Mithras, I think, needs a little something in Tier 5, but a lot of people love Oberon corvettes, or if you haven't invested in other mega corporation tech trees, and if you like Corvette gameplay but you're already invested in Oberon, well, here you are. But let me tell you, one good thing about the Oberon corvettes is they come with navigation expert, and personally, Oberon corvettes are my favorite corvettes to fly. They're not the best or the most effective. My favorite overall, as far as tactics and firepower, would be Jupiter Arms. And the most effective, I would say, and the most survivable is Akula Vector. But if you just want to play a game and have fun, Oberon corvettes are there, and they can be pretty darn deadly as well. On top of all that, their officer briefing is navigation expert. Very, very simple. It is active, so you have to set your energy to engines. If you do, your energy consumption is halved, which means you can stay at double speed twice as long. The downside is, of course, you're not getting that 10% speed buff from Navigation 101, and of course your other power consumptions are plus 30%, which right off the bat you notice there's 20 points difference there, which means that when you put power to weapons, you can only leave it there for 2/3 as long. When you put power to shields, you can only leave it there 2/3 as long, but you can go fast twice as long. The other thing is that Navigation Expert doesn't affect the amount that your shields deplete when you're taking damage. If you put your shields up and you don't take damage, you'll notice that your shields go down roughly 1 point a second. Same with power to weapons until you fire. Now this will drain power to weapons a little faster, and it will drain your shields faster, but let's face it, as a Corvette, you're only throwing up your shields in the worst circumstances, and it's really negligible because the amount of shields that you're being depleted because the damage they are absorbing is where you're going to lose your power from. You're not going to lose your power from using 1.3 power a second to have your shields up as opposed to 1 power a second. So its effect on shields is negligible. Its effects on putting power to weapons is a little bad, but not that bad if you think about it, but it is a little worse. But its effects on how long you can maintain the double speed of putting power to engines is extraordinary. I do not go to battle in a Corvette without Navigation Expert unless it's a really, really silly, fun Akula Vector build. unless you're teleporting, if you're using your engines to move instead of teleporting, you want Navigation Expert in a Corvette. I use Navigation Expert in my Oberon Destroyer builds, my main builds, and I use Navigation Expert in my Oberon Artillery Cruiser builds. And I also use it in many, many other builds. It's very useful. It's not the most powerful in the game. But if you're putting power to engines for most of the match, either because you're kiting the enemy or because you're trying to get to the optimum position to fire or because you're sneaking up on the enemy, when you arrive, you won't get there as fast as using other officer briefings or modules, but when you arrive, you'll have a lot more power to play with when you finally strike. And that's the key to Navigation Expert, is you're sacrificing speed to maintain a good average speed. And you can still supplement that good average speed with things like afterburners or thrust amplifiers, but Navigation Expert will still be there for you. And even though it's technically active, it's one of those passive active ones. It's not going to do anything for you when you're stationary or you're not putting power to engines, but when you put power to engines, you will be able to do it longer. And for many builds, that is the key to success, not trying to ramp up raw speed to get 5 times normal speed. For certain builds, that's what you want. For many other builds, it's not. So I think Navigation Expert is one of the most important officer briefings for things like Corvettes, fast destroyers, and fast artillery cruisers. Alright, so that sums up the officer briefing review in Dreadnought for 2021 on Direct Dreadnought Gundam and More. I made this one a little longer than the last review because I didn't want to gloss over anything, and if I didn't think an officer briefing was powerful, I at least wanted to give it a minute or 2 or 3 to explain why I feel this way and why it may not be worth your time. And I wanted to give a little more attention to the different combinations you can use with officer briefings while using them with other officer briefings or with modules, and I wanted to whet your palate and get you hungry for taking advantage of what's already in the game that's not considered an exploit but just good use of your time and experience, and trying to bring all the modules and officer briefings together and encourage you to go into other tech trees and to get outside your comfort zone, to experiment with the game more. And also, getting out of your comfort zone and playing other ships makes the game less boring to you. I have found that ever since I got all the ships in Dreadnought, except for a couple of the hero ships, ever since I did that and then I fully researched each ship, I put enough time into each one to really have fun with the game, have a new experience every match, and to really gain insight to what some of my opponents are thinking, what some of my teammates are thinking. And when you get a good collection of officer briefings, it adds a little more fun while you're waiting for a match to pop, to experiment in your mind or on paper or even in game with what different officer briefings can do for you. Now remember, most of them are not going to dramatically change your gameplay, except for maybe Retaliator. Retaliator is definitely going to change your gameplay, because as a Dreadnought, I do believe Dreadnoughts just aren't as effective without it as with it. But many of these officer briefings may change your play style or the way you look at the game or the way you build your ships, or vice versa. You may have a great ship, a great build, and been putting a lot of time into the game and wondering why other players seem to have a little bit of an edge, or when you're dueling a player, they always seem to win with just a little sliver of health left. And now you know why, and now you know, hopefully, which officer briefings are worth your time to invest in and which ones you're probably going to pass up unless you plan on collecting that ship anyway, so that you can enjoy Dreadnought that much more. Well, that's it from me for now, and I'll see you soon in Sinley Bay.